Hey guys, we got some new merch in the merch store that's all linked down below, or you might see some of the shop pop up down below the video. Be sure to go check it out if you want to get some new merch. We got some new designs, they're pretty sweet. When other kids were asking for video games or football boots for their birthdays, I wanted a disposable camera, and the process of getting the pictures developed seemed like nothing short of wizardry to me. My passion for photography stayed with me right through secondary school, which to my parents' infinite frustration, I showed very little interest in. I understand why they were so stressed about my poor academic performance. I didn't enjoy getting bothered by teachers every day. I just knew what I wanted to do with my life. And then after I left school at 16, I went off and did it. I interned with a professional photographer for a year, got a feel for the job, and then started freelancing for just about anyone who'd pay. It took a few years of building up a serious portfolio, but once I had one, along with the necessary experience, I was ready to apply for some serious jobs. The job market for photography can be interesting, to say the least. And without going into too much very lurid or tedious detail, there wasn't much out there that wasn't excessively seedy or excessively boring. But there was one job that caught my eye, so much so that I positively jumped at the chance to apply for it. Overseas photographer for the Times, one of the most prestigious newspapers in British history. I applied, then had an interview so shaky that I was convinced that it had slipped through my fingers. But somehow, someone saw some potential in me and got the call back with good news just a few days after. That job took me all over the world, and it was incredible. But then every so often, I get a chance to go somewhere a bit dicey. I went to Afghanistan in 2011, Iraq in 2012, then in January of 2014, I was asked if I wanted to go to Syria. And for those that need a brief primer, the Syrian civil war kicked off in mid-2012, following a year of fiery protests and violent government crackdowns. 2013 was a year of escalation, with various armed rebel groups getting all kinds of foreign backing before taking the fight to government forces. But then 2014 marked a distinct shift in the landscape of that resistance. And before the end of 2013, it was mostly secular groups of pro-democracy rebels fighting under the banner of the Free Syrian Army. But just after the new year, you started hearing all about these Islamist and jihadi groups springing up, some of which were supposedly connected to Al-Qaeda. Our team's job was to drive into Aleppo, hook up with our contact in the Free Syrian Army, and then establish what relationship, if any, the FSA had with the jihadis. We flew over to Turkey at the end of February, spent a few days in a city near the Syrian border, and then crossed over in early March. It was a whole different feeling to Iraq and Afghanistan because when I visited those countries, the fighting in both places has started to die down. Syria, on the other hand, was a live conflict, a war in progress. We didn't fly in on a military aircraft or cross the border after having our passports checked. We crossed into Syria without permission, with no safety net, and without any idea of what would happen. And let me tell you, that felt very different. After driving into eastern Aleppo, we hooked up with our rebel contact in a place called Jabal Badro. The journalist I was with, Ben, had worked with Omar on a previous trip to Aleppo back in 2012, so for them, it marked quite an emotional reunion. Ben had won over Omar and his unit of rebels by bringing them cartons of cigarettes and boxes of basic medicines, and he did the same thing when I was with them in 2014. Apparently handing out paracetamol and packets of ciggies makes you very popular in a war zone. And so the week we spent with Omar's unit was as positive as it was productive. I picked up a bit of Arabic, partied with the rebels, and got at least half a dozen shots that I considered some of the best I'd ever taken. But that first week was little more than acclimatization, both physically, and Christ was a hot, and mentally. Because we planned on spending our second week with another group of rebels, who, unlike Omar's group, were much more connected with the jihadi group known as Nusra Front. The NF, as I'll call them from now on for the sake of ease, were actually connected to Al-Qaeda at one point, and their madman-in-chief was based in Iraq for a number of years. He was actually sent into Syria in 2011 with the goal of exploiting the chaos of the civil war to gain a foothold among the populace. But once he was there, and he got a taste of power, well, he didn't quite fancy letting it go. The NF's madman-in-chief was just that, mental, but he wasn't stupid. He knew that snatching journalists and cutting their heads off was a really bad look, and that if they wanted to keep getting their hands on the weapons that the US and EU were feeding to the larger, less scary-looking rebel groups, they better stay on their best behavior. Knowing we weren't going to be actively hunted was probably the only reason we felt even remotely safe traveling anywhere near NF-controlled areas. But even so, we had no desire to connect with the group, its leaders, or its fighters. And the only trouble was, fate had other plans. Finding your way around the city, especially if you don't know it all that well, can be difficult at the best of times. But then, imagine almost everything you use for reference, be it street signs, landmarks, or places of business, are suddenly destroyed. All of a sudden, even people who knew Aleppo were having trouble finding their way around. I'm not just talking a few bullet holes or craters either. Entire streets have been leveled by airstrikes, and aside from all the debris, our drivers said it was the thin layer of dust on everything that really threw them off and made all the winding streets of eastern Aleppo look the same. I'm sure you can see this coming a mile off already, but I'm a photographer, not a writer, so I'll just leave all that structuring to the professionals and just get on with my story. So, on our way to meet up with this other, less frightening group of rebels, we took a wrong turn, and we didn't even realize that we'd taken a wrong turn until the people we thought had been sent to meet us suddenly aimed their guns at us and ordered us to kneel. We literally had no idea what was happening or who they were, so initially we thought it was this other group of pro-democracy rebels just being a bit overcautious when it came to their security. They were all terrified of spies, everyone was. But later, we found out that we hadn't been rather rudely welcomed by some paranoid soon-to-be friends. We'd been taken prisoner by a different group. One with strong ties to both NF and another jihadi group that hadn't quite made a name for itself yet. Once it was clear that we'd been taken prisoner, our driver, who had been captured along with us, began immediately trying to negotiate our release. We figured all they wanted was money, and they were promised a ton. But according to the group's leader, a guy called Abu Khalid, they'd get a shed load more money by selling us to another, much wealthier group of militants who operated out of a place called Raqqa. We asked what would happen to us there, but Abu Khalid said that he neither knew nor cared. All he cared about were the vast stacks of cash the Raqqa group was offering for any British or American prisoners. It was a grim moment, accepting we were probably going to be held hostage for a very long time. Both me and Ben trusted both our governments and our employers to work towards securing our release, as well as that of our driver, Othman. And to us, it was just a matter of time before we were released, because at that stage of the war, it was all about getting backing or funding from outside the country. It made very little sense for any armed group to just kill us. In fact, we thought that we were more in danger of being caught and executed by government loyalists than any group of rebels, jihadists included. There was just too much money to be made ransoming off 2 British journalists. So even though this mysterious group were willing to pay our captors 40,000 USD for the both of us, it was an investment they could make millions from. It must sound a bit mental to some people. I mean, it sounds mental to me just writing it all these years later, but being a prisoner wasn't all that bad. The group that took us prisoner just wanted to make some money, and they hated the government loyalists far more than they could ever hate us. So after a few days, our guards started to warm up to us a bit. They had to feed us and keep us safe because this other jihadi group said that they wanted us alive and unharmed. But after a few days of being regular fixtures around the compound they occupied, they took our restraints off, invited us upstairs from the basement they were holding us in, and then basically just let us hang out. They told Othman, "If your lot try and run, we'll kill you. But other than that, just behave yourselves." We could roughly converse with the jihadi blokes in our crappy Arabic, but if we wanted any serious dialogue, we'd use our driver, Othman, as a translator. The group holding us weren't frontline fighters. Their only job was to guard us, and seeing as they were actually pretty alright fellas who'd just been sucked into the maelstrom of the country's civil war, we got talking about this and that. They were very, very curious about our lives back in London, and I am deadly serious when I say they must have asked us 1,000 questions over the course of those 9 days in captivity. They wanted to know what London was like, what kinds of things we ate back home, and what kinds of places we lived in. But Abu was clearly the most senior guard among them, seemed particularly interested in what football teams we supported. Ben wasn't into football much. He went to a private school and was more into his rugby. But for me, my passions were photography first, then football second. And I had, still have, a particular love of my local side, Queen's Park Rangers. I know I'm going to get stick from my fellow fans for this, but QPR aren't a big team, and assuming Abu only follows the top league, I didn't expect him to know them. But then when I told him I was a QPR fan, his face lit up, and he launched into a massive speech to Othman, who was acting as our translator. I could recognize the odd word here and there, and he kept saying QPR in his accent over and over, so I knew he was talking about the football club. But then Othman turns to me, and in so many words, this is what he said. "Abu says he's a great admirer of your Moroccan attacking midfielder, Adel Tarabt." And my jaw dropped. But Othman continued. "Abdul says Tarabt's contribution of 19 goals, 16 assists to QPR's 2011 season was a huge achievement for a player of his age, that he thoroughly deserved to win the championship's Player of the Season award." And you know what? Abu was exactly right. As a die-hard QPR fan, I loved Adele, and I still do. He was absolutely phenomenal during that 2010 season, and I cheered for every single one of those 19 goals. Through Othman, I asked Abu if he remembered the goal Tarabt scored on Boxing Day of 2010. Abu jumped up off the floor with this big smile on his face and started mimicking the exact movements of what came to be known as the Christmas cracker. He intimidated Tarabt's cheeky back heel to trick one player, then mimed tapping the ball through another player's legs before acting out the absolute rocket of a kick that even the goalkeeper's gloves couldn't put a stop to. I was in raptures, or Taraptures, you might say, and I asked if Abu remembered Tarabt running over and literally hugging some random QPR fans in celebration of his goal. And stuff like that was why he was so popular. He loved us and we loved him, and neither of us was afraid to show it. Abu did remember the hug, and then that was it. We launched into what must have been a 2-hour conversation about football with almost everyone gathered around for the entertainment, and the whole thing was just crazy. There I was having an in-depth football talk with a man that had taken me hostage. It marked a sort of high point in our time in captivity because for a brief moment, it was like we weren't prisoners anymore. It was like we were among friends, and although I wasn't to know it at the time, I think it was that chat about Tarabt that saved our lives. We spent another 2 days in Abu's compound, and those were probably the best 2 days we spent there. We were given generous portions when invited to sit and eat with the rest of the rebels, after which they shared cigarettes and sweets with us. Then, after dinner, they had 100 more questions for us about our lives back in London. However, after about an hour of chatting, Abu asked if we could have a word in private, and by private he meant me, him, and of course Othman. We walked over to a quiet corner, and through our driver-turned-translator, I asked him if there was any news on the hostage transfer. I made it clear that I wasn't making any demands on him. I was just anxious about being in the dark regarding when and where we'd be transported. Abu looked at Othman, then at me, Then after a sigh and a moment of thought, he started feeding his reply to Othman for translation. And as I watched him talk, I watched the color slowly drain from Othman's face. He turned to me, and more or less this is what he said. Abu says he is hesitant to sell us to the group in Raqqa, Othman said, and initially I thought it was because Abu thought that he was being stiffed. And the idea of selling us to the other group for pittance so that in turn could make millions had probably left a pretty bad taste in his mouth, and that's not what was bothering him. He said he could live with the prospect of selling us to someone who'd eventually release us, but that's not what this other group intended to do. This other group went by a few different names at the time: the Mujahideen Shura Council, the Army of the Victorious, the Congregation of Monotheism and Jihad. But the name they'd been given in the months that followed is one that'll live in infamy: ISIS. The group that wanted to buy us were just months away from officially renaming themselves the Islamic State. And the reason they wanted us alive is because they wanted to decapitate us, film it, and then turn our executions into sleek propaganda videos that'd end up online. And by the time Othman finished telling me that is, everything except their ensuing change of name, I must have looked as pale as he was. I then begged Abu not to sell us to those people, that we could guarantee them tens of thousands of pounds if they ransomed us instead of selling us on. He told us it was too late, and that ISIS were already on their way to collect us. They'd be at the swap location a few miles outside of Aleppo in less than 48 hours, and if we weren't there to collect, there'd be trouble. And by then, Othman had taken over in terms of leading the discussion, and after a few more minutes of talking, he gave me the gist of what had been said. Abu was going to escort us back to our contact, Omar, and then tell his bosses and the ISIS guys that we'd managed to escape during an attack by the government soldiers, and he only had two conditions. The first was that we got the hell out of Aleppo immediately. If his bosses got wind of the fact that he just let us go, he was a dead man, so that was non-negotiable. The second thing, however, was that I gave him the little QPR supporters club card that I kept in my wallet, and so he could have something to remember me by. I gave it to him in a heartbeat. Then just a few hours later, we were on the move again, back towards Omar's group, who we'd spent our first couple of days with. 48 hours later, around the same time we should have been handed over to our ISIS executioners, we were waiting in Hatay airport for our Istanbul transfer, and then after that, we were headed home. Ben ended up writing the story he'd been asked to write, and he used plenty of my pictures too. But he made no mention of the kidnapping in his story, and the pictures I took of us and our hostage takers have never seen the light of day. I wanted Ben to be able to thank Abu in his story, but we knew that wouldn't be possible without putting his safety at risk. Following a prolonged and intense battle, the Syrian army retook full control of Aleppo in December 2016. Syrian state media then announced that they had fully secured the city after an evacuation deal for the remaining rebel fighters and civilians was reached, meaning there was a slim chance that Abu managed to get out alive. I know he technically wasn't on the right side of that conflict, as they say, but if you knew it, I don't think you could call any group from that conflict the good guys and not choke on those words. I don't know what else he did during the war, but Abu saved our lives, and for that, I'll be forever grateful. I sometimes wonder if he's still alive, and if he ever made it out of Syria. So if you just so happen to hear this, Abu, and you're anywhere near Loftus Road, then reach out so we can go to a game together and talk about football and peace instead of war. In April of 2016, my friend Tony and I were on our way to a birthday party in our hometown of Baton Rouge. It was the 23rd birthday of a mutual friend, and to celebrate the occasion, her parents allowed her to throw a party at their house in Santa Maria. I remember being incredibly excited for the party, And part of the reason we were so excited was that Santa Maria is home to some truly beautiful homes, and therefore some incredible places to throw a party. The only trouble was, neither of us knew the neighborhood very well. I was at the wheel while Tony was there in the passenger seat. He had his phone in his hand, trying to figure out exactly where we needed to go, whilst being the in-car DJ for our pre-party tunes. And so while he was adept at picking bangers to get us all turned up, he wasn't the best navigator I could have asked for. Santa Maria is divided up into 4 distinct sections, and between them is the Santa Maria Golf Course. We ended up finding the right one, but the real trouble came when we had to find the correct street. A text from a friend said that we wanted some number on Manchac, so we were looking for something like Manchac Road or a Manchac Avenue. But then, after turning on the Manchac Lake Drive, which we figured was the one we wanted, we were suddenly faced with Manchac Way Avenue, Manchac Trace Avenue, and Manchac Crossing Avenue. 4 different streets, all named Manchac, meaning we had no idea which street the party was on. I asked Tony to give one of our friends a call just to confirm the address, but when we finally managed to get a hold of someone, the music was too loud for us to get any coherent answer out of her. She said that she'd double-check with our friend to get the right address and would call us back. But she didn't, and we ended up driving up and down Manchacs trying to work out if it was the number they gave us at Manchac Way or the same number on another Manchac. And we tried looking for clues, things like cars lined up outside the house, groups of people chatting on the porch, or maybe this sort of faint thumping of bass in the distance. Things would have been easier if the party was actually inside, but part of the agreement to use her parents' place was that the party be centered in the backyard and pool area. That way, the house wouldn't get trashed. But that also meant that both those numbered houses looked almost identical. They were all dark on the outside, neither had any obvious signs of activity, and both houses had a bunch of cars lined up outside. And so in the end, we decided to turn down the driveway on one of the Manchac other places, and because we figured the worst thing that had happened is that we'd have a very confused homeowner tell us that it was the other one. And so, I drove us up the driveway, stopped the car, then Tony and I sat there in silence for a moment. I remember the silence, the total, complete silence of being in that driveway, and how I got a really strong feeling that we were not at the right address. The house was dark, and the curtains seemed like they were drawn, but then suddenly a flicker of movement near the curtains started to catch our eye. We knew someone was home, but if this was where the party was at, I doubted that they had been hiding in a front room taking peeks out at cars in the driveway. I told Tony that I didn't think it was the place, but he insisted on knocking on the door just to make sure. I told him I wasn't sure that was a good idea, then the last thing he said to me was, "What's the worst that could happen?" Before my windshield suddenly shattered. Shards of glass rained down on us as gunshots rang out, and I remember seeing flashes coming from the darkness of an upstairs window. I remember my heart thumping in my chest as my mind caught up to what was happening. Then the next thing, I was ducking down, hunching over and gasping for breath as the stark reality hit me that we were being shot at. Time seemed like it was slowing down. I could feel each bullet smashing into the car, and I felt frozen with terror. Then suddenly, it was like I heard this voice in my head yelling, "Put the car in reverse, or you're both dead." As raw panic distilled into the need for action, I remember fumbling with that gear stick before quickly throwing the car into reverse. The tires spun slightly as I slammed my foot down on the pedal, causing the tires to squeal before a sudden jolt backwards. I heard Tony yell something, but I couldn't make out what. I was too busy looking into the rear view to see if anyone was behind us. Then we put the car into drive and we sped off into the night, air rushing into the car from where the windshield was gone. I remember this mix of relief, but fear washing over me as we drove away from that danger, but I was still wired from all the adrenaline, and I was halfway to shouting something like, "Oh my God, we made it," when I noticed he'd been shot. I pushed the car's engine to its absolute limits, speeding like a crazy person as the world outside became a blue of streetlights and shadows. And I remember looking over to Tony and seeing how pale he looked, and how much pain he seemed to be in, and then the fear of losing him came crashing down on me like a wave. I kept yelling at him to hold on, that we were headed to a hospital, and that we'd be there in no more than a few minutes, because all I had to do was keep my foot down, stay on the interstate, and take the exit ramp as soon as we saw that Baton Rouge General. I had no idea how many times Tony had been shot, and I figured that I might have been shot too, but I just couldn't do anything about it because I had to keep my eyes on the road while I was weaving in and out of traffic. And that was probably the worst part about the whole thing for me personally. The thought of how if I passed out at the wheel at those speeds, both of us would probably be dead. I thought I could feel blood in my stomach and legs because it was very warm and wet down there, but like I said, I couldn't look, or it'd be game over for the both of us. I remember nearly crashing into another car as I swerved onto the exit ramp, and then nearly crashing a second time as I skidded into the parking lot of the hospital. I stopped almost right outside the doors, jumped out of the driver's side, and then ran around to Tony's side while calling out for help. I opened up his door, kind of hopeful because of how quick we made it, but when I saw Tony's face, I panicked. He was white as a sheet. He was struggling to breathe, and there was blood everywhere, and his eyes looked almost glazed over like he was just minutes away from death. I kept yelling at him to stay with me, shaking his shoulder while telling him help was on the way. Then the next thing I know, there's a bunch of paramedics rushing over to get Tony out of the car and into the hospital. As they wheeled Tony away on a gurney, I mentioned how I thought I'd been shot. Remember I told you about feeling very warm and wet in my pants? Well, it wasn't blood. It was piss. And while we were getting shot at, I straight up peed my pants and struggled with the shame of that for some time before I just came to terms with it. I had a Marine who served in Afghanistan tell me that some of his squad mates used to always need to pee real bad anytime they got into a shootout. They'd be lying down someplace, like on their stomachs, shooting at the bad guys, and this one Marine would roll onto his side, pull his wiener out, and then just start pissing right there where he laid. The pisser said he'd rather show off his 2-inch wonder to the rest of the squad than soak his underwear, and the Marine told me how not a single one of them considered him a coward. I met the guy in a group therapy session maybe 6 or 7 months after that night, and when I mentioned the pissing myself thing, he just laughed. I was kind of offended at first, and he said he was just laughing at the idea that I considered myself a coward. He'd heard my story already, and he considered me one of the ballsiest MFers he'd ever met. He told me I'd done the exact right thing, to the letter, in terms of going into action mode and zooming to that hospital. Just being able to back out of a driveway while under fire was impressive to him, but not crashing on the way to the hospital was what made him think that I'd make a fine Marine if I ever wanted to take that path in life. And I managed to keep it together all the same, and just told him, "Thanks, dude. It means a lot." But when I got back to my car, I cried like a baby. And I mean ugly cried too, not some cool single tear rolling down my cheek like in an action movie hero situation. It didn't just mean a lot. That meant the entire world to me. And for the first time since sitting in that hospital waiting room, I didn't feel like a total piece of trash. Oh, and speaking of the waiting room, I guess I kinda got diverted there for a minute or two, and let me get back on track. Sitting in that waiting room felt like I was in another dimension. Time was slowing down, the place was full, and I never felt so alone. And I felt like I was trapped between wanting to hear some news about Tony and then dreading whatever the news might be. It was hellish, and I mean that in the truest sense of the word. If there is a hell, it probably feels a little like that waiting room in Baton Rouge, at least before the fiery parts anyway. My mind kept replaying what had happened in that driveway, and checking my phone became almost like a ritual, something to break up my thoughts while letting our friends know what had happened. I looked up every time the nurse walked in, thinking, this is it, only for it not to be. They'd call someone else or just walk right through. Sometimes I felt like I was watching myself in a bad dream, a nightmare where everything smelled like antiseptic and the lights were so bright I felt like they were stinging my eyes. After what felt like forever, a doctor stepped into the waiting room and finally called my name. He then sort of ushered me into a quiet section and gave me the news. And when he told me Tony was alive and that they were optimistic about his recovery, I never felt relief like it before. I had to put my head in my hands because I thought I was going to burst into tears, and then, after pulling myself together, I listened as the doctor continued. He explained that although a bullet had entered Tony's chest, it had missed his heart, along with all of his major arteries. However, the bullet did collapse a lung, which is why he was struggling to breathe by the time we pulled into the hospital's parking lot. And to fix it, the doctor performed a procedure that involved inserting a tube into Tony's chest, which reinflated his lung and allowed it to expand properly. The bullet also broke a rib, but while that would be very painful, it'd heal over time. And the most important news, though, was that Tony was stabilized and had been moved into the intensive care unit where his pain would be managed and he could be monitored. He wasn't completely out of the woods yet, though, but seeing how young, fit, and healthy he was, the prognosis was good. I could either go home and rest or stick around the hospital, and I'd be able to see him in a couple of hours. I still had glass and blood all over me, so I told the doctor I'd return in a few hours after a shower and a change of clothes. And at home, I talked to a bunch of people who had been at the party, like mine and Tony's mutual friends, and I agreed to pick a few of them up on the way back to the hospital. We had to wait for almost an hour before we were allowed in, but when we were, 2 groups of us went in to see him. 1 group of 2 and 1 group of 3. I went in with our friend Cherry, and walking down the corridor to his ICU room was like the longest walk of our lives. I remember coming to the door and bracing myself for what I was about to see. I knew he was probably going to be okay, but it was still daunting as hell walking towards that door. And then when I walked into Tony's room, it was a very huge mix of emotions. I was more relieved than I'd ever been in my whole life to see Tony alive, but he barely looked any better than he did when I first got him to the hospital. It was really shocking to see him in such a vulnerable position, but the thing that really sticks with me is just how happy Tony was to see us. He was still weak and couldn't move at all, but he had just enough energy after waking up from surgery to talk to us a little before the nurses shooed us out of the room, saying Tony needed his rest. But before we left, Tony and I had something of a moment together. He told me I saved his life, but I told him he was wrong about that. Dead wrong. It was he that had saved my life, because if I had driven to that party on my own, I have no doubt in my mind that whoever shot at us would have aimed for me and not him. He hadn't opened up his door yet, so the lights in my car didn't switch on, but what Tony did have was his phone, on full brightness, held at chest height, which from the shooter's point of view probably lit him up like a Christmas tree. The guy was a terrible shot and only landed 1 direct hit on us, but I have no doubt that he used the light of Tony's phone as sort of a reference point on where to aim. And if he hadn't been there, then it would have been me that took the shooter's 1 lucky shot, and then I definitely would have passed out on the way to the hospital if I wasn't killed instantly by that shot. And in so many words, he took the bullet that was meant for me. And Tony was in the hospital for just over a week, and strangely enough, that was the same day the man who shot him pleaded no contest to charges of attempted manslaughter. It got downgraded after that instead of murder because apparently in the last year alone, this dude's house had been targeted in 2 home invasions by 2 different groups. 1 group ended up going to prison, and apparently one of the guys told our shooter that his homies were going to get him. So when we rolled up to his driveway in a car that he didn't recognize, he opened up on us before giving us a chance to identify ourselves. His attorneys said that he was so scared that he didn't want to take any chances, but even with it being his first conviction, the judge called him a danger to others and gave him 3 years in prison. I would have liked to have seen him given more time, but there was a period where we thought that he might get no jail time, so having him get at least some time was a pretty huge relief. Tony has since made a full recovery and has somehow managed to find it in his heart to forgive the guy who shot him. I guess that's the kind of grace that I should have expected from him. But for me, it's a hell of a lot harder to simply forgive and forget, not when both of us came so close to death. For our 2nd anniversary, my boyfriend and I arranged a weekend stay at a luxury log cabin. We'd been going to the same coffee shop for a few months when I accidentally knocked his iced latte all over him like a total klutz. Rob was so nice about it. Then the next time I bumped into him, I offered to pay his dry cleaning bill. He said he'd rather I'd paid him back by taking him out to dinner, and since we totally had some chemistry between us, I accepted. And now cut to about 2.5 years later, and we're flying down to Nashville to spend a few days with Rob's parents before heading off into the hills of Monroe County, way out near the North Carolina state line. When he'd first suggested the idea over dinner, I was dead against it. Rob and his family loved all things outdoors related, and they were hardcore about it too. And so at first I was scared his cabin would be some one-room hunting shack, and it'd be dinners of raw deer meat for all 3 nights. Now Rob assured me that wasn't the case. Then when I was still skeptical, he showed me the website. The cabin he picked out looked incredible. It was set onto a hillside with a large deck overlooking what looked like a stunning view. There was a fire pit, a hot tub for soaking under the stars, and that was just outside. The inside had an open floor plan with high vaulted ceilings and exposed wooden beams. There were also leather sofas, state-of-the-art appliances, and a whole kitchen complete with a farmhouse sink and breakfast nook. But I think the thing that really caught my eye was the old stone fireplace, because I could constantly picture me and Rob curling up together in front of it after a long hike through the woods. And that's all after a couple's shower in the bathroom that, I kid you not, had heated floors. I've never stayed in a hotel room that fancy,